On a warm, quiet morning in the small town of Greenfield, James stood at the edge of the park, his worn military boots digging into the grass. The air smelled of fresh dew and pine, the kind of peaceful, still day that makes everything feel calm. To the passing observer, it seemed like just another mundane morning. People were out walking their dogs, children played on the swings, and the hum of a distant lawnmower filled the air. But for James, it wasn't just any morning. James had served his country proudly, his Marine Corps uniform a symbol of his years of dedication. But in recent years, the uniform had become more of a burden than a badge of honor. After returning home from active duty, he had tried to fit back into civilian life, but the world around him felt strangely disconnected from everything he'd experienced. The noise of his past battles, the loss of comrades, and the constant pain from his injuries lingered in his mind and body like a shadow he couldn't shake off. Every day, the weight of those memories and the constant ache in his leg reminded him of everything he had given and everything he had lost. James wasn't someone to complain about his situation. He had always prided himself on his resilience, on the strength that kept him standing in the face of the most harrowing experiences. But today, as he stood in the park, something inside him snapped. He hadn't planned it, he hadn't woken up that morning thinking about what he was going to do. It was the heat of the moment that had driven him to this point. He adjusted his jacket, tucked in his shirt, and then stood up straight. Without a word, he raised his right hand to his forehead in a crisp, perfect salute. It wasn't a simple gesture. It wasn't just a casual motion done out of routine. The salute was everything to him. It was a connection to his past, to his brothers in arms, to the ones who had never come back. It was a ritual that, for a brief moment, took him back to the days when he was part of something much larger than himself. He stood there, holding the salute with all the pride and dignity he could muster. His body trembled slightly under the weight of the action, but he refused to lower his arm. It was a symbol of respect, a respect for the fallen, for those who had fought alongside him, and for the country he loved. James had always been a man of action. When he was in the Corps, he didn't hesitate, he did what needed to be done, even when it meant sacrificing a part of himself. Now, standing in that park, he felt a different kind of urgency. The world seemed to move slowly around him, and with each passing minute, the sun climbed higher, warming his back, making the air thick and heavy. But he didn't lower his arm. He could feel the strain in his shoulder, his fingers going numb, but he remained motionless, holding on to the memories of comrades lost in the line of duty. A few people had noticed him by now. A jogger slowed down as he passed, offering a nod of acknowledgement. A mother walking her child gave him a curious glance, but kept walking, her gaze flicking back every few seconds as if unsure of what she had seen. James didn't mind the attention, in fact, he welcomed it. People needed to understand the price of freedom. They needed to see the sacrifices that had been made for their comfort, for their safety. He wasn't looking for praise or applause, he wasn't even sure why he was doing it. But there was something in the stillness, in the act of standing there in silence, that felt like a way of honoring the life he had lived, the life he had fought for. His legs began to ache. The pain from the old wounds in his knees crept up his spine, a dull, gnawing sensation that seemed to mock his determination. He clenched his jaw and forced himself to stay still. He had endured far worse than this in his days of service. This was nothing, this was just a test of his will. But then, as the hours stretched on, the discomfort in his body began to turn into something more insistent. The heat from the sun was relentless, the sweat beginning to trickle down his face. His hand trembled, and for a moment, he felt his resolve faltering. His body wanted to give in, to lower his arm and collapse into the cool grass beneath him. He could hear his body begging him to stop, to rest, to give up the fight. But he wasn't ready to stop. He had made a promise to those who couldn't stand anymore. Just as the pain became unbearable, something unexpected happened. A rumble in the distance. The low, throaty sound of motorcycle engines reached his ears. At first, it was faint, almost as if he were imagining it, but then it grew louder, closer. James didn't lower his salute. The motorcycles were heading straight toward him, their engines roaring, the vibrations of their sound rattling the ground beneath his feet. He didn't know who they were, but the timing felt like a sign, like this moment was not just his alone. He stood there, unwavering, as the motorcycles appeared on the horizon, coming into view, kicking up dust as they rolled into the park. A group of men on sleek, polished bikes, all wearing leather jackets and bandanas, slowing as they approached James. Their faces were tough, hardened by years of life on the road, but there was something different about the way they moved. They didn't look like troublemakers. They didn't look like the kind of people who would disrupt his moment. They looked respectful. The leader of the group, a man with a weathered face and a patch on his jacket that read "Randy," was the first to stop in front of James. His eyes studied the Marine for a moment, and then his gaze flicked to the salute, his brow furrowing in thought. James held his position. His arm was trembling now, and the pain in his shoulder was unbearable, but he refused to break. This moment was bigger than his discomfort. It was bigger than the pain in his body. It was for all those who couldn't be here. James felt a strange sense of connection as the bikers gathered around him, their presence offering an unexpected solace. The world seemed to slow down, the hum of the motorcycles now replaced by the whisper of the wind through the trees. For a brief moment, the pain in his body faded into the background, and he could almost hear the distant echoes of laughter and voices from the past, his brothers in arms, his comrades, the ones who had stood beside him in the darkest of times. They were gone now, but as the bikers circled around him, something told him that this moment was more than just an act of homage. It was a shared understanding, a connection that transcended the years and the distance. Randy, the leader of the group, remained a few steps away, still observing James. He didn't rush to interrupt, he simply watched with a quiet respect, his expression unreadable but thoughtful. There was a quiet strength in his posture, something that spoke of years spent on the road, facing hardships of his own. Randy had seen his share of battles, though perhaps not in the same way as James. The life of a biker was one of freedom and rebellion, but it was also a life built on loyalty, respect, and the bonds formed in the trenches of life. James could see all that in Randy's eyes, and something inside him urged him to let go of his pride and accept the help that had been offered. But pride was a powerful thing. James had spent his whole life holding on to it, even when it had left him alone and battered, far from the camaraderie he had once known. His right arm, still held in salute, began to shake violently. The strain on his shoulder was becoming unbearable, and the pain from his legs, injured in a deployment years ago, was starting to surge through his body. He could feel himself slipping, the darkness at the edges of his vision threatening to close in. He had already pushed himself beyond his limits, but there was something about the act of standing there, holding his salute, that kept him grounded. It was a symbol of everything he had fought for, everything he had lost, and he couldn't bring himself to drop it. The bikers, sensing the struggle, began to murmur among themselves. Randy stepped forward, his boots crunching softly on the gravel, and placed a hand on James's shoulder, steadying him. James didn't flinch. He had been touched by the hand of a soldier many times before, but there was something different about Randy's touch. It was firm, sure, but also kind, a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. "You don't have to do this alone, man," Randy said softly, his voice rough with the weight of his own experiences. "We're here for you." For a moment, James didn't respond. He just stood there, his salute unwavering, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the steady rhythm of his breath, the harsh rasp of his lungs, and the distant hum of the town around them. Everything felt too much, and yet, somehow, it felt right. There was no going back now. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about something bigger than himself. It was about honoring the fallen, about showing that even in the face of pain, even when the world seemed to be falling apart, there was still something worth standing for. One of the bikers, a younger man with a scruffy beard and a leather jacket adorned with patches, stepped forward and stood next to Randy. He didn't say anything at first, he just stood there, looking at James with a mixture of awe and respect. His eyes flickered to the salute, then back to James, and for a moment, it seemed like he was trying to understand the weight of what was happening. Finally, he spoke. "You know, when we ride, it's not just about the freedom or the speed," the young man said, his voice low but clear. "It's about the brotherhood. The bond. We ride together because we know what it's like to have someone have your back, no matter what. And right now? You've got ours." James looked at him, trying to make sense of his words. The young man's face was weathered, marked with the signs of a hard life on the road, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet understanding, that made James want to listen. He couldn't explain why, but in that moment, he felt a surge of gratitude for these strangers who had stopped to honor him. They didn't owe him anything, yet they had given him more than most people ever had. Randy nodded and stepped back, allowing the other bikers to gather around James. They didn't speak much, they didn't need to. Each of them took a position, standing in solidarity with him. The rumble of their engines, which had once felt so loud and intrusive, now seemed to complement the silence around them. The park was eerily still, save for the sounds of nature and the distant voices of people walking by, pausing to observe the unexpected gathering. James began to feel the weight of his salute more acutely now. His fingers were numb, his arm trembling with exhaustion, and his body was screaming for relief. He didn't know how much longer he could hold it, but something inside him refused to let go. There was a sense of duty, a sense of pride, that pushed him forward even as the physical toll mounted. He had never been one to quit, not in the Marines, not in life, and not now. And then, just as he thought he might finally collapse, something incredible happened. The lead biker, Randy, spoke up again. "You don't need to do this alone," he said, his voice carrying the weight of something deeper than just words. "We're with you. You don't have to stand here by yourself." James looked at Randy, then at the other bikers who had gathered around him. Their faces were solemn, but there was a shared understanding in their eyes, an unspoken bond forged by something more than just the road. They didn't need to know the full story of his pain, of the years he had spent in the military, or the battles he had fought both on and off the field. They didn't need to know about the struggles he had faced after returning home. All they needed to know was that, in this moment, they were united in something bigger than themselves. With a deep breath, James finally lowered his arm, the salute ending as quietly as it had begun. The relief that washed over him was overwhelming, but there was also a sense of loss, a sense that he had let go of something important. The bikers, sensing this, didn't cheer or clap, they simply stood in quiet respect, each of them understanding that the moment wasn't about praise. It was about honor. For the first time in what felt like years, James felt like he wasn't alone. The bikers didn't judge him, they didn't question his motives. They simply stood by him, offering their support in a way that words couldn't fully express. In that moment, James realized that sometimes, the greatest act of courage isn't in standing alone, but in allowing others to stand with you. And as the bikers revved their engines and prepared to leave, James felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. It wasn't about the salute, the pain, or the sacrifices he had made, it was about the understanding that, no matter how hard life got, he wasn't alone. The sun was beginning its slow descent behind the trees, casting long shadows across the park. The air had started to cool, but James could still feel the warmth of the day on his skin, the lingering sensation of standing in the same place for so long. His body ached from the strain, but there was an unfamiliar sense of calm in his mind. The bikers had been kind enough to stay with him, standing in solidarity without any demands, without any need for recognition. Their quiet presence had allowed him to step back from the pain that had consumed him for so long. For the first time in months, maybe even years, he felt something resembling peace. The leader of the group, Randy, had said something earlier that stayed with James: "You don't have to do this alone." In those words, there was a truth that resonated deep inside him, a truth he hadn't fully understood until now. He had spent so long trying to carry the weight of his experiences by himself, holding on to his pride as if it were the only thing left. But standing here, in this park with these strangers who, in that moment, felt like comrades, James realized that perhaps he had been wrong. The weight of his pain didn't have to be carried in isolation. And neither did the pain of others. The bikers began to prepare to leave, their engines rumbling to life one by one. James remained where he was, still catching his breath, still processing everything that had happened. Randy was the first to approach him once more, his boots scraping against the gravel as he walked slowly toward James. His eyes were soft now, no longer filled with the usual tough exterior that came with the biker lifestyle. There was a vulnerability there, something raw that James could relate to. Randy stopped in front of him, pausing for a moment as if weighing his next words carefully. "You're a Marine, right?" Randy asked, his voice quiet but firm. James nodded, his throat tight as he swallowed the lump that had formed there. The past few hours had brought so many emotions to the surface, emotions that he had kept buried for far too long. "Yeah," James said, his voice rough. I am." Randy didn't ask him about the specifics. He didn't pry into James's history, his injuries, or the battles he had fought. He didn't need to. He understood. Randy had been through his own battles, though in a different form, on a different battlefield. Life on the road was hard, it was filled with uncertainty, loss, and moments that made you question everything. Randy didn't need to know the details to recognize the same sense of struggle in James's eyes. "You've got the heart of a fighter," Randy said. "But you don't have to fight alone anymore. We've got your back." James didn't know what to say. His mouth was dry, and the words felt stuck somewhere deep inside. He had always prided himself on being strong, self-reliant, and capable of handling whatever came his way. But in that moment, he realized that the strength he had once relied on so fiercely had been eroded by years of solitude, by the weight of his experiences. There was no shame in accepting help, no weakness in admitting that you couldn't carry it all on your own. It was a revelation that hit him harder than any physical injury ever had. As the bikers revved their engines one by one, James stood there, watching them, his mind swirling with thoughts and emotions. The sun was setting now, casting a golden hue over the park, turning everything into something dreamlike, as if time itself had slowed down just for this moment. He felt the weight of the world lifting off his shoulders, if only for a brief moment. He wasn't alone anymore. He was part of something bigger, something he hadn't realized he needed. Randy gave him one last look before climbing onto his motorcycle. "You ever need anything," he said, his voice loud over the noise of the engine, "you know where to find us." James nodded, his throat tight as he watched the group of bikers rev their engines and pull away, disappearing down the road with the same defiant roar they had arrived with. The rumble of their motorcycles gradually faded into the distance, leaving James standing there in the quiet park. The stillness around him was almost deafening now, but it was different from before. It was no longer a reminder of his isolation, it was a reminder that he had found something, someone, who had offered him a chance to stop carrying the weight of his past by himself. The pain in his body was still there, gnawing at his joints, his legs aching from standing for so long. But it no longer felt like an insurmountable obstacle. For the first time, James realized that he could ask for help when he needed it. He didn't have to pretend to be invincible, to be the man who could carry everything alone. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks, and yet, it was liberating. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to fight every battle by himself. Maybe there were people out there, people like the bikers, like Randy, who understood the struggle and were willing to stand with him. He made his way back to his truck, each step slower than the last, his mind still racing with everything that had just transpired. The events of the past few hours felt surreal, as though they had been pulled from the pages of a story he'd never expected to be part of. He had set out that morning with a single purpose, a single act of defiance that he had hoped would somehow bring meaning to his life. What he had received, though, was far more than he had bargained for. The bikers had shown him something he hadn't realized he needed, a reminder that life was still worth fighting for, and that it was okay to lean on others when you couldn't carry the burden on your own. As James climbed into his truck and started the engine, he couldn't help but glance one last time at the park, at the empty space where the bikers had gathered with him. The sun was now just a sliver on the horizon, casting its final rays of light over the town, and for the first time in a long time, James felt something other than the weight of his past. He felt hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he had finally found a way forward. The road ahead wasn't clear, and he knew it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, James didn't feel like he was fighting alone. He had brothers, people who understood the cost of sacrifice, the price of freedom, and the strength that came not from standing alone, but from standing together. As the truck pulled away from the park and the town of Greenfield faded behind him, James allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The road ahead was uncertain, but it didn't matter. He had learned something important today. Sometimes, the hardest part of healing isn't in the physical pain or the battles you fight, it's in letting go of the pride that keeps you from asking for help. And in that small, quiet park, surrounded by bikers who had shown him that it was okay to lean on others, James had taken the first step toward healing. He wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. The weeks following that fateful day in the park felt like a strange mixture of clarity and chaos to James. His body, battered by years of injuries and the weight of his past, was slowly healing, but it wasn't just the physical wounds that had begun to mend. The emotional scars, the invisible ones, were still there, just beneath the surface, but something about what had happened, the biker's quiet support, Randy's words, had given him a new outlook. It was as if a light had been cast into the darkness, showing him that there was more to life than the burdens he had carried for so long. It wasn't easy, of course. Healing never was. There were days when the pain would surge again, when the memories would come crashing back, threatening to overwhelm him. And there were moments when the doubts crept in, when he questioned whether the kindness of the bikers had been a one-off, a fleeting moment in time that couldn't possibly hold any real significance. But then, he would remember the way they had circled around him that day, the quiet understanding in Randy's eyes, and he would push those doubts away. The world was different now, and for the first time in years, James was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could make something of that difference. A few weeks later, James was driving back from a job interview in a nearby town. It had gone well, at least better than he had expected. He was no longer the man he had been when he first left the Marines, bitter, disconnected, angry. He was someone new, someone willing to make a change. As he drove down the winding roads that led back to Greenfield, his mind wandered to the bikers. He hadn't seen them since that day, but the memory of their presence lingered with him. He thought about Randy's words often, "You don't have to do this alone." James wasn't one to believe in fate, but he had learned in the last few weeks that sometimes life had a funny way of bringing things together. He had begun to reach out more, reconnecting with old friends, with people from his past that he had pushed away over the years. And slowly, ever so slowly, the walls that he had built around himself started to come down. He wasn't there yet, but he was trying. And that felt like a step in the right direction. As he turned the corner onto his street, his truck slowed to a halt. There, parked in front of his house, were several motorcycles, their chrome gleaming in the sunlight. James blinked, his heart skipping a beat as he recognized the familiar sight of Randy's bike among them. His pulse quickened, and for a moment, he didn't know whether to be excited or nervous. He hadn't expected to see the bikers again, certainly not so soon. But there they were, waiting for him. James parked his truck, his thoughts racing as he got out and walked toward them. The sound of the motorcycles rumbled in the air, a comforting and intimidating sound all at once. As he approached, he saw Randy standing by his bike, his arms crossed over his chest, a small, knowing smile on his face. "Thought I'd drop by," Randy said as James came closer, his tone light but carrying an edge of something deeper. "Figured you might want some company." James stared at him, a little taken aback. It was a small gesture, but it meant something more than just a casual visit. Randy wasn't here to check up on him, he wasn't here to make sure James was okay. No, Randy was here because he wanted to be. And somehow, that made all the difference. "I wasn't expecting this," James said, his voice a little rougher than he intended. "What's going on?" Randy shrugged, his grin widening. "Nothing much. Just thought you could use a ride." James's brow furrowed in confusion, but Randy didn't give him a chance to ask more questions. Before he could say anything else, Randy nodded toward the group of bikers who had gathered around their motorcycles. "You up for a ride, James? We could use another brother on the road." A rush of emotion hit James like a wave, sweeping him off balance. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anyone to follow up, to keep the bond they had formed that day alive. But here they were, the bikers, standing together once again, offering him a chance to ride with them, to be a part of something bigger than himself. They were giving him something he hadn't realized he needed, a sense of belonging, a way to take the next step forward. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," James said, a hesitance in his voice. He hadn't been on a bike in years. His injuries made him cautious, made him question his ability to keep up. But there was something about the way Randy looked at him that made James pause. Randy saw the hesitation in James's eyes and stepped closer, his expression softening. "Listen, I know it's not easy. Hell, I've been there. But sometimes, the hardest part is taking the first step. We're not asking you to do anything crazy. We're just offering you a chance to ride with us, to be part of something again." James stood there for a long moment, the weight of his past pressing down on him, his thoughts racing. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this, but he realized that it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had a choice now. He had the chance to take control, to stop being afraid of the next step. "I'll ride," James finally said, his voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "But I'm warning you, I'm a little rusty." Randy grinned, clapping him on the back. "Don't worry about that, man. We'll take it easy. It's about the ride, not how fast you go." The bikers revved their engines, the sound of their motorcycles echoing in the air, a powerful reminder of the bond they shared. James climbed onto one of the bikes, carefully adjusting himself to the seat, feeling the cool leather beneath his hands. As he started the engine, he could feel the familiar rumble beneath him, the vibration running through his body. For a moment it was as if the world around him disappeared, and he was simply a part of the machine, the road, and the freedom that came with it. It wasn't about running away from his past, it was about moving forward, about choosing to face the world on his terms. The group took off, the motorcycles roaring to life as they sped down the road. James felt the wind rush past him, the sense of freedom and adventure washing over him like a baptism. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, not since his time in the Marines. It was raw and real, and for the first time in a long time, James felt truly alive. The ride was quiet at first, each biker focused on the road ahead. But as the miles passed, the group began to loosen up. Randy led the way, his bike cutting through the wind with ease, while the others followed in a loose formation. James found himself falling into rhythm with them, his body moving with the bike as if he had never been away. The tension in his shoulders began to melt, his mind clearing as the world around him seemed to open up. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his past lifting, replaced by something more powerful, something full of possibility. The road stretched ahead, winding through the hills and valleys, the landscape shifting from open fields to dense forests, then back to small towns and empty highways. As they rode, James felt a connection to the land, to the people, and to the bikers around him. This wasn't just about escaping. This wasn't just about running away from the past. This was about moving forward together, about taking control of his life and his future, 1 mile at a time. The days that followed the ride felt different for James. There was a newfound sense of freedom in his life, something that had been absent for years. The miles he had ridden alongside the bikers had opened something inside of him, a part that had been buried deep under the weight of old wounds, both physical and emotional. It was as if the rumble of the engines, the wind in his face, and the sense of unity with the group had shaken loose the walls he had built around his heart. The group of bikers, Randy especially, had taken James in without hesitation. They didn't treat him as a charity case or an outsider, they welcomed him as a brother. Every weekend, they would meet up, sometimes for long rides out into the country, other times just to hang out and share stories. They had their fair share of laughs, but there was always an unspoken understanding between them. They all carried something heavy, something from their pasts that they didn't need to verbalize. It was enough that they were there for one another. James started opening up slowly, first in small ways. He'd share a laugh, make a joke, or tell a story from his time in the Marines. He found that the more time he spent with the group, the more he felt like he was shedding the layers of isolation he had wrapped himself in for so long. The bikers weren't just offering him companionship, they were offering him something far more valuable, they were showing him what it meant to truly live again. One evening, as the sun began to set and the bikes were parked outside a local bar, Randy came over to James and sat next to him on a weathered bench. The rest of the group was inside, unwinding after their ride, but Randy seemed in no hurry to join them. He glanced over at James, his usual easy smile replaced by something more contemplative. "You've come a long way, man," Randy said, his voice low but sincere. "I see it. You're not the same guy who showed up that day in the park." James looked out across the parking lot, the last rays of daylight casting long shadows across the asphalt. He had come a long way, that much was true. But there were still days when he felt like the old him, the one who couldn't let go of the past. The wounds still ached, both the ones that couldn't be seen and the ones that could. "I'm not sure I even know who that guy was anymore," James said quietly. "But I'm not the guy who stood there in that park either. You made me realize something. I don't have to keep pushing people away. I don't have to keep pretending like I'm fine." Randy nodded, his expression soft but full of understanding. "None of us are fine all the time. Hell, no one is. But it's what we do with that, how we deal with the crap life throws at us, that matters. You've taken the first step, James. The hardest step. And I'm proud of you for it." James was quiet for a long time, absorbing Randy's words. It wasn't just the words themselves that had an impact, but the sincerity with which they were spoken. Randy didn't have to say those things. He didn't have to take the time to make sure James was okay. But he did. And that made all the difference. It made James realize that maybe he wasn't as far gone as he had thought. Maybe there was still time for him to rebuild, to find something worth living for, to find peace. The next few weeks passed by in a blur. James continued to ride with the bikers, each trip out on the road offering him a little more clarity, a little more healing. He had started to take on small jobs around town, offering his skills to those who needed help. The physical labor gave him a sense of purpose, something to focus on other than the constant reminders of what he had lost. He began to feel connected again, not just to the bikers, but to the community that had once been his home. One afternoon, after a long day of work, James sat on his porch, watching the sunset. It was a peaceful moment, one he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control of his life. The things that once haunted him, the memories of battle, the scars on his body, no longer defined him. They were part of his story, but they weren't his entire story. James had realized that he could choose who he wanted to be moving forward. As he sat there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from Randy, "We're heading out for a ride tomorrow. You in?" James smiled to himself as he typed out a quick reply, "Wouldn't miss it for the world." There was no hesitation in his response. No doubts. The man who had once questioned everything, who had thought he was beyond saving, was no longer that person. He was ready. Ready for the road ahead, ready for whatever challenges might come, and most importantly, ready to be part of something bigger than himself. The next morning, James met the bikers at their usual spot. Randy was already there, his bike gleaming in the sunlight, a grin on his face. The group was small that day, but it didn't matter. There was a unity between them, a bond that didn't need to be explained. It was the kind of bond that only people who had been through the hardest parts of life together could understand. As they revved their engines and took off down the road, James felt the familiar rush of wind in his face, the thrill of the open road beneath him. But this time, there was something different. He wasn't just riding to escape. He wasn't riding to forget. He was riding because, for the first time in a long time, he was living. The world around him seemed to blur as they raced down the highway, the landscape unfolding in a never-ending series of twists and turns. It was as if everything had come together, his past, his present, and his future. The pain that once defined him was now just another part of the journey, something he could look back on without it controlling him. And in that moment, as the sun rose higher in the sky, James felt a sense of peace that had been long overdue. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he was no longer afraid. He had found his place among the bikers, among his brothers. And for the first time in years, James felt like he had finally come home. The weeks that followed brought a newfound sense of balance to James's life. The rhythms of the world, the daily grind, and the quiet moments between the chaos all started to fall into place. What had once seemed like an insurmountable, fractured existence now felt manageable, even fulfilling. The bikers, Randy in particular, had become a constant source of support, but it was not just their company that had shifted something in him, it was the journey itself, the decisions he made each day to embrace life again. The mornings were the hardest. Those first few moments of waking up, when the weight of the world could feel like it was pressing down on his chest, those were the moments where his past would creep back in. But James had started developing a routine to combat the old habits of self-doubt. He would stand in front of the mirror, look at himself, and repeat the same words every morning, "You are not broken. You are healing. Every day is a step forward." It was a simple affirmation, but it worked. Slowly, it helped him rebuild the confidence he had lost during those long, silent years. It wasn't always easy, but the more he said it, the more he believed it. One day, as James was working on his truck, Randy pulled up, his bike kicking up dust as it came to a halt. There was a certain urgency in Randy's movements as he took off his helmet, his eyes scanning the horizon. He approached James, who had been wiping the sweat off his forehead with a rag, and clapped him on the shoulder. "Got something for you," Randy said with a grin, his tone serious beneath the light-hearted delivery. James raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" "I've been talking with the guys, and we think you're ready. We're putting together a ride for the Veterans Charity next month, and we want you to lead it." The words hung in the air for a long moment before James could process them. Led? He had never imagined himself in a leadership role. His experience with leadership had been in the military, where it was expected, even demanded. But in civilian life, in this new chapter, the thought of taking charge was daunting. The idea of being the one everyone looked to for guidance, for direction, felt almost too much. "You sure about that?" James asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Randy nodded, his face softening with understanding. "I've seen the way you've come around, man. You've got the heart for it. And you've earned the respect of the guys. They trust you. I trust you." James felt the weight of Randy's words sink in. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the people who had chosen to believe in him when he couldn't believe in himself. It was about the opportunity to be the kind of man they could look to, the kind of leader who didn't shy away from responsibility but embraced it. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. After a long pause, James wiped his hands on his jeans and looked up at Randy. "All right. I'll do it." The preparation for the ride came quickly. The charity event, which was designed to raise funds for veterans and their families, was a cause that held deep significance for James. It was more than just a ride, it was a chance to give back to a community that had given so much to him. As the days passed, James threw himself into the planning. He coordinated with local businesses, reached out to other groups, and made sure everything was lined up. It was exhausting, but it was also invigorating. For the first time in years, he felt like he was contributing to something bigger than himself. The day of the ride arrived, and it was nothing short of overwhelming. The parking lot was filled with bikes, rows upon rows of gleaming motorcycles, each one with a rider who had their own story, their own reason for being there. James stood at the front, his helmet in hand, as the bikers began to gather around. Randy was there, as always, standing by his side with a look of pride in his eyes. The weight of the moment hit James in full force, and for a moment, he thought about backing out. But then he looked around at the people who had come to support this cause, his brothers and sisters on the road, united in purpose, and he knew he couldn't. The ride itself was a blur of motion. The wind whipping through his hair, the rumble of the engines beneath him, and the sound of the motorcycles in perfect unison. As they sped down the highway, James felt a deep sense of belonging, like he was finally where he was meant to be. But it wasn't just about the ride. It was about the message they were sending, the message of hope, of resilience, of the power of community. As the group rode together, James felt a sense of pride swell within him, one that he hadn't known in years. He wasn't just part of the group anymore, he was helping to lead it. And that was something he never thought he would be capable of. As they reached their destination, a local park where the charity event was taking place, James was taken aback by the sight before him. There were dozens of people gathered. Veterans, their families, community members, all waiting to show their support. The bikes lined up in perfect rows, and the riders disembarked, their faces filled with a quiet sense of purpose. James could see the gratitude in their eyes, the understanding that they were all part of something bigger than themselves. The event went off without a hitch. The speeches were heartfelt, the donations were generous, and the camaraderie among the riders was palpable. As the day came to a close, and the last of the attendees began to leave, James stood alone for a moment, reflecting on everything that had led him here. The life-altering decision to stop running from his past, the quiet support of Randy and the bikers, the way the community had embraced him, it had all come full circle. James was no longer the man who had been broken by war, who had stood at the edge of his life, unsure of which way to turn. He was someone new, someone who had learned to embrace the scars of his past while forging ahead into the future. And yet, as he stood there, a thought lingered in his mind: what comes next? The question wasn't one of doubt, but one of possibility. He had taken the first steps toward healing, toward finding his place in the world again. But the journey was far from over. There was more to discover, more to learn, and more to give. As the last of the bikers climbed onto their motorcycles, preparing to head home, Randy walked up to James, clapping him on the back. "You did good today, man. Real good." James smiled, the weight of the day settling in. "Thanks, Randy. I couldn't have done it without you." "You didn't do it alone, James," Randy said, his eyes full of sincerity. "None of us ever do." And as James watched the sun dip below the horizon, the last rays of light casting a warm glow over the park, he realized that it was true. He wasn't alone anymore. The journey had taken him places he never expected, and he had learned that the road ahead wasn't something to fear, it was something to embrace. With the bikers, with his brothers and sisters, he was ready to keep riding, ready to keep living. The world was wide, and the road stretched out before him, filled with endless possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, James didn't feel like he had to face it alone. He had found his place, his family, his purpose. The ride had only just begun.